The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield Creek, a frontier settlement tucked deep in the Colorado Territory, where the law was written in weathered Bibles and enforced by men who believed mercy was weakness. The year was 1878, and this isolated community of barely 300 souls lived by rules as rigid as the iron rails that had never quite reached their doorstep. Sarah May Thornton sat in the cramped wooden cell behind Fletcher's General Store, her delicate hands folded in her lap, auburn hair hanging in loose waves around her pale face. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men tip their hats and women whisper behind their fans, but today those same townspeople would gather to watch her die. Sarah May, her mother's voice trembled through the barred window. Tell them it ain't true. Tell them you never looked twice at that. That rancher. Through the bars, Sarah May could see Martha Thornton's weathered face, etched with lines of worry and shame. Her father stood beside her, his jaw set hard as granite, refusing to meet his daughter's eyes. Ezra Thornton had built his reputation as the town's most successful merchant through unwavering adherence to what he called proper Christian values, and his daughter's scandal threatened to destroy everything he'd worked for. "I won't lie, Mama," Sarah May whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her chest. "I love him. I love James McKinley, and I won't pretend otherwise, not even to save my own life." The crack of her father's hand against the wooden frame made Sarah May flinch. "You foolish girl." Ezra's voice carried the weight of a man whose world was crumbling. "That man works cattle for other folks. He ain't got 2 coins to rub together, and he comes from nothing. You were promised to Pastor Whitmore's son, a man of standing, a man of God." Outside, the town was already stirring. Sarah May could hear the murmur of voices, the scrape of boots on wooden sidewalks, the creak of wagons as families arrived from the surrounding homesteads. Word had spread quickly through the territory. The merchant's daughter had disgraced herself, and the Council of Elders had decreed the ancient punishment. Elder Cornelius Blackwood's voice boomed across the settlement as he called the gathering to order. A tall, gaunt man with silver hair and eyes like winter ice, he'd led this community for nearly 2 decades, his word carrying the weight of divine authority. "Citizens of Millfield Creek," he announced, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air, "we gather today not in celebration, but in solemn duty. The Lord's justice must be served." The crowd pressed closer, their faces a mixture of righteous anger and morbid curiosity. Women clutched their children close, whispering prayers and warnings. Men stood with arms crossed, their expressions grave. This was frontier justice, harsh and unforgiving, where reputation meant survival and shame could destroy entire families. Sarah May closed her eyes and thought of James, the way his calloused hands had been so gentle when he'd helped her down from her father's wagon 2 months ago, the quiet strength in his voice when he'd spoken of dreams beyond cattle and endless horizons. She'd known from the moment their eyes met that he was different from the other men in town. Where others saw only a hired hand, she saw intelligence, kindness, and a dignity that had nothing to do with the contents of his pockets. Their courtship had been brief and secret, stolen moments after Sunday service, quiet conversations during her walks to the schoolhouse where she taught the settlement's children. James had never presumed to touch her beyond holding her hand, never spoke of love until the day he'd found courage to ask her father for permission to court her properly. Ezra Thornton had thrown him bodily from the store. "You got some nerve, McKinley," Ezra had snarled, his face red with indignation. "My daughter ain't meant for some saddle tramp who don't even own the horse he rides. You stay away from her, or I'll have the sheriff deal with you." But love, Sarah May had discovered, wasn't something that could be ordered away like an unwanted peddler. She'd continued to meet James in secret, their affection growing stronger with each stolen encounter. When Mrs. Henderson had spotted them walking together near the creek, holding hands and speaking in hushed tones, their secret had exploded through the town like dynamite. The Council of Elders had convened immediately. In their eyes, Sarah May had committed an unforgivable sin, not just disobedience, but a betrayal of the social order that kept their community stable. A merchant's daughter consorting with a common ranch hand threatened the very foundations of their carefully constructed hierarchy. "Bring her out," Elder Blackwood commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. The cell door creaked open, and rough hands pulled Sarah May to her feet. She walked with her head held high, her blue dress fluttering in the morning breeze as she was led to the center of the settlement's main square. The crowd parted before her, creating a corridor of hostile faces and whispered condemnations. At the edge of the crowd, she saw James McKinley standing beside his horse, his face pale but determined. Even from a distance, she could see the pain in his dark eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he fought to control his emotions. He was a man of average height but solid build, his clothes simple but clean, his presence commanding despite his humble station. Elder Blackwood raised his hand for silence. "Sarah May Thornton," he intoned, his voice carrying across the settlement, "you stand accused of wanton behavior, of defying your father's righteous authority, and of corrupting the moral fiber of our community. How do you answer these charges?" Sarah May lifted her chin, her voice carrying clear and strong. "I answer that I have loved purely and honestly, and that if this be a crime, then I am guilty of nothing more than following my heart." A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Shameless!" Another voice called out, "Stone her!" The mob's energy was building, fed by years of hard living and the need for someone to blame for their frustrations. Elder Blackwood nodded gravely. "Then by the authority vested in me by God and this community, I pronounce you guilty. The sentence is death by stoning, to be carried out immediately, as commanded by ancient law." The crowd pressed forward, and Sarah May saw hands reaching for rocks, faces twisted with righteous fury. This was the moment she'd dreaded, the moment when her community would become her executioners. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for salvation, but for forgiveness, for the people she'd loved who were about to become her killers. The first stone was raised, and Sarah May Thornton prepared to die. The morning air hung thick with tension as Elder Blackwood raised his weathered hand, preparing to signal the beginning of the execution. The crowd pressed forward, their faces twisted with righteous fury, stones clutched in white-knuckled fists. Sarah May stood in the center of the circle, her blue dress a stark contrast against the dusty brown earth, her chin raised in defiant acceptance of her fate. "Let God's justice be done." Blackwood's voice boomed across the settlement, his words echoing off the wooden buildings that surrounded the makeshift execution ground. The first stone was lifted high, catching the morning sunlight like a weapon of divine retribution. Mrs. Henderson, the town's most vocal moral guardian, stepped forward with murder in her eyes. "This is what happens to girls who forget their place," she shrieked, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. But before the rock could leave her trembling hand, a shadow fell across the circle. "No." The word cut through the morning air like a blade, quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Every head turned toward the source of the voice, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. James McKinley stood at the edge of the circle, his tall frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He wore his simple work clothes, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and leather boots caked with honest dirt. His hat hung low over his eyes, but nothing could hide the steel in his expression or the determined set of his jaw. "I said no," he repeated, his voice louder now, carrying across the settlement with unmistakable authority. "You want to stone someone? You'll have to go through me first." Elder Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "McKinley, you have no authority here. This is God's justice being served." James stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. With each step, he seemed to grow taller, more imposing. The crowd instinctively moved back, creating a path as he walked toward the center of the circle where Sarah May stood. "Who's God?" James asked, his voice carrying a quiet challenge that made several townspeople shift uncomfortably. "The God I learned about in my mother's Bible spoke of mercy and forgiveness. He talked about loving your neighbor, not murdering young women for following their hearts." "Blasphemy!" shouted Pastor Whitmore, his face flushed with indignation. "You dare question the righteous judgment of this community?" James reached Sarah May's side and turned to face the mob, placing himself between her and the armed crowd. Up close, Sarah May could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. He was terrified, but he stood his ground anyway. "I question any judgment that calls for the death of an innocent woman," James replied, his voice steady despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "Sarah May Thornton has committed no crime, except choosing to love someone you deem unworthy." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "She disobeyed her father. She brought shame on her family. She corrupted the moral order." The voices blended together into a cacophony of righteous indignation. Elder Blackwood raised his hand for silence, his pale eyes fixed on James with hatred. You speak of innocence, McKinley, but you're the serpent who tempted her. You're the one who led her astray with your false promises and common blood. James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. I never made her any promises except to treat her with the respect she deserves. I never touched her inappropriately, or spoke to her with anything but honor. If loving someone purely and honestly is a crime, then I'm guilty alongside her. Then you'll die alongside her, Blackwood snarled, his composure finally cracking. Seize him. 3 men stepped forward from the crowd. Tom Fletcher, the store owner, Buck Williams, the town's unofficial sheriff, and Samuel Morse, a rancher who'd always resented James's skill with horses. They moved cautiously, knowing James's reputation as a man who could handle himself in a fight. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, McKinley, Buck said, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. You're outnumbered 300 to 1. James spread his feet slightly, shifting into a fighter's stance. Then I'll make every one of those 300 count. Behind him, Sarah May placed her hand gently on his shoulder. James, please, she whispered. Don't throw your life away for me. One of us dying is tragedy enough. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. In that brief exchange, she saw not just love, but a fierce protectiveness that took her breath away. I'd rather die standing beside you than live knowing I let them kill you, he said quietly. The first attacker came fast, Tom Fletcher, wielding a thick wooden club. James sidestepped the clumsy swing and delivered a devastating uppercut that sent Fletcher sprawling in the dust. The crowd roared, some in approval of the violence, others in outrage at James's defiance. Buck Williams drew his pistol, but James was already moving. He dove low, tackling the sheriff around the waist and driving him to the ground. The gun flew from Buck's hand, skittering across the dirt as the 2 men grappled in the dust. Samuel Morse circled around, trying to get behind James, but the rancher was ready. He rolled away from Buck's clumsy punches and came up swinging, his fist connected with Morse's jaw in a blow that echoed across the settlement like a gunshot. For a moment, James stood triumphant in the center of the circle, dust swirling around his boots, his chest heaving with exertion. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but his stance remained defiant. "Anyone else?" he called out, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. Elder Blackwood's face was purple with rage. "Enough!" he screamed. "If you won't be taken alive, then you'll both die where you stand. Everyone who can hold a stone, step forward." The crowd surged forward, no longer content with the ritual of execution. This had become a mob, hungry for blood and violence. Men, women, even some of the older children pressed forward, their faces twisted with mob mentality. James pulled Sarah May close, his arms encircling her protectively. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." She pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beating of his heart. "You did save me," she whispered back. "You showed me what real love looks like." The crowd raised their stones, and James McKinley closed his eyes, preparing to shield the woman he loved with his own body. But then, carried on the morning wind, came a sound that made every person in that crowd freeze. Thunder. Not the thunder of an approaching storm, but the rhythmic pounding of hoofbeats. Dozens of them growing louder with each passing second. The sound echoed off the surrounding hills, seeming to come from every direction at once. Elder Blackwood's face went pale. What in the name of... The thunderous sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Some of the townspeople began to look around nervously, stones forgotten in their hands. And then, on the eastern horizon, silhouetted against the morning sun, they appeared. Riders. Dozens of them, moving in perfect formation across the ridge that overlooked Millfield Creek. Even from a distance, their discipline was obvious. This wasn't a random group of travelers, but an organized force moving with military precision. The crowd began to murmur, uncertainty replacing their bloodlust. James lifted his head, his eyes straining to make out the approaching figures. Sarah May gripped his arm tighter, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Who are they?" someone in the crowd whispered. Elder Blackwood stood frozen, his authority suddenly feeling as fragile as morning frost. The approaching riders were still too far away to identify, but their very presence had shattered the mob's confidence. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and James McKinley held Sarah May closer, both of them watching the horizon with growing anticipation. Whatever was coming, It was about to change everything. The thunderous drumming of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls that surrounded Millfield Creek. The mob that had been so eager for blood just moments before now stood frozen, their stones forgotten in trembling hands as they watched the ridgeline with growing unease. James McKinley tightened his protective embrace around Sarah May, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Even from this distance, he could see the discipline in their formation. This was no random group of travelers, but a military unit moving with purpose. "Dear God," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the stone falling from her nerveless fingers. "There must be 50 of them." The riders crested the ridge in perfect formation, 2 columns of 25 riders each, their horses moving as one, dust clouds billowing behind them. At their head rode a man who commanded attention, even at a distance. Tall and straight in his saddle, he wore a dusty black coat and a wide-brimmed hat. A silver star gleamed on his chest, catching the morning sunlight. "That's a U.S. Marshal's badge," Buck Williams breathed, his voice barely audible over the approaching thunder of hooves. The formation thundered down the hillside with controlled precision, coming to a halt just outside the town's main square. The sudden silence was deafening after the thunderous approach. The marshal dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with authority. "I am U.S. Marshal Robert Kane," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the stunned crowd. "I'm here on official federal business." Elder Blackwood struggled to regain his composure, stepping forward with false bravado. "Marshal, we are in the middle of dispensing lawful justice. This woman," Marshal Kane interrupted, his voice cutting through Blackwood's bluster like a blade, "is under federal protection as of this moment." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sarah May felt James's arms tighten around her, his confusion matching her own. Marshal Kane reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder. "Mr. McKinley," he said, his voice carrying a note of respectful acknowledgement, "I believe it's time you learned the truth about your father." James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "My father? Marshal, my father died when I was 5 years old. He was just a ranch hand like me." "No, son," Marshal Kane said gently. "Your father was Captain William McKinley of the United States Army. He died a hero at the Battle of Gettysburg, leading a charge that saved countless lives. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously." The crowd stirred uneasily. James stared at the marshal in disbelief, his mind reeling from this revelation. "Your mother was protecting you," Marshal Kane explained. "Captain McKinley had made powerful enemies, men who would have killed his family for revenge. She changed your name, moved west, and told you nothing to keep you safe." Elder Blackwood's face was growing redder by the moment. "This is all very interesting, Marshal, but it has nothing to do with our situation here." Marshal Kane's eyes hardened. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, it has everything to do with your situation. You see, Captain McKinley wasn't just a war hero, he was also a federal investigator, sent to Colorado Territory to look into reports of corruption and illegal activity." The marshal's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Several men in the crowd began to look around nervously. "The kind that involves stealing government land grants, embezzling federal funds, and murdering federal agents who got too close to the truth," Marshal Kane continued. "Your father's investigation was getting close to exposing a network of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial capital." Sarah May felt James's body tense with understanding. "That's why he was killed," he said quietly. "It wasn't battle. It was murder. Federal crimes don't have a statute of limitations, Mr. McKinley. And now, 25 years later, we're back to finish what your father started." Elder Blackwood's commanding presence was cracking like dried leather. "This is preposterous," he blustered. "The corruption your father was investigating was centered right here in Millfield Creek," Marshal Kane replied coldly. "And Elder Blackwood was one of the principal conspirators." The accusation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Gasps and shouts of disbelief echoed across the square. "You're lying," Blackwood snarled, but his voice betrayed his fear. "You and your conspirators have been stealing federal land grants, selling them to railroad companies, and pocketing the profits. You've murdered at least 3 federal agents over the years." The marshal gestured to his men, who began to spread out around the square, their hands resting on their weapons. "We have evidence, Mr. Blackwood. Documents, witness testimony, and a paper trail that leads directly to your door. This whole community, the rigid social structure, the harsh punishments, it's all been designed to keep people in line, to stop them from asking questions," James realized aloud. "Exactly," Marshal Kane confirmed. Fear keeps people quiet, brutal justice keeps them obedient, and convenient scapegoats, he looked meaningfully at Sarah May, keep them focused on manufactured moral crises instead of real crimes. Sarah May felt the pieces clicking into place. "That's why you were so determined to have me killed," she said, her voice carrying across the square to Elder Blackwood. "Not because I fell in love with James, but because our relationship threatened your control." Marshal Kane smiled grimly and nodded to one of his men who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. "We have the signed confession of your associate, Thomas Brennan, who was arrested in Denver last month." The name hit several men in the crowd like a physical blow. James watched as the color drained from the faces of Tom Fletcher, Pastor Whitmore, and several others. "Brennan told us about the land schemes, the murdered agents, and the network of corruption that has been bleeding this territory dry for decades," Marshal Kane continued. "He also told us about a young woman who had been marked for death, not for any crime, but because her relationship with James McKinley threatened to expose the truth." The crowd was beginning to fracture now, as people realized they had been manipulated and used. Some began to back away from Elder Blackwood and his supporters, while others looked around with growing anger. But James noticed that Blackwood and his core conspirators were not going down without a fight. Their hands were moving toward their weapons, and the desperate look in their eyes suggested they were prepared to kill their way out of this situation. "Marshal," James called out, his voice carrying a warning, "I don't think they're planning to come quietly." Marshal Kane's expression hardened as he saw the same thing. "Citizens of Millfield Creek," he announced loudly, "I strongly suggest you step away from Elder Blackwood and his associates. Things are about to get very dangerous." The moment of truth had arrived, and James McKinley stood ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the woman he loved was finally safe and that his father's death would finally be avenged. The tension in the town square stretched taut as a bowstring as Elder Blackwood, and his conspirators realized their decades of corruption had finally caught up with them. The federal marshals had spread out in a wide circle, their hands resting on their weapons, ready for the violent confrontation that seemed inevitable. James McKinley kept Sarah May close behind him, his eyes scanning the desperate faces of the men who had been ready to kill them just moments before. Tom Fletcher's hand hovered near his gun, while Pastor Whitmore's face had gone pale as death. Buck Williams kept glancing toward the edge of town, as if calculating his chances of escape. "You have no authority here," Elder Blackwood snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "This is our territory, our justice." Marshal Kane's voice remained calm and steady. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement of federal funds, and the murder of 3 federal agents. You have the right to surrender peacefully." "Surrender?" Blackwood laughed bitterly. "I've built this community with my own hands. I've brought order to chaos, civilization to wilderness. You want to destroy everything we've accomplished for what? Some long-dead federal investigator?" "My father wasn't just some investigator," James said, his voice carrying across the square with new authority. "He was a man who believed in justice, real justice, not the twisted version you've been peddling here." The crowd had split into 2 distinct groups now. Those who had been manipulated by Blackwood's lies were backing away, while his core conspirators were clustering together, their hands moving toward their weapons. 25 years, Sarah May called out, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. 25 years of fear and lies. 25 years of good people being punished while criminals prospered. Mrs. Henderson, who had been ready to throw the first stone, now looked around in bewilderment. All this time, all the people we've driven away, all the harsh punishments, it was all to protect thieves and murderers. "Wake up, you fools," Blackwood shouted at the crowd. "These federal men want to take everything we've built. They want to tear down our community." But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Millfield Creek were beginning to understand how they had been used, how their faith and fear had been twisted to serve corruption. Marshal Kane raised his hand, and his men tensed, ready for action. "Last chance, Blackwood. Surrender now, and you'll get a fair trial." "Fair trial?" Blackwood's laugh was wild and desperate. "From men who come here with lies and fabrications? Never." The elder's hand dropped to his gun, and everything exploded into motion. Blackwood's shot rang out across the square, but his aim was wild, driven by desperation rather than skill. Marshal Kane had already thrown himself to the side, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced precision. Tom Fletcher and Buck Williams drew their guns simultaneously, but they were facing federal marshals. Men who had survived countless gunfights on the frontier. The marshal's return fire was swift and accurate. James pushed Sarah May behind an overturned wagon and grabbed a fallen marshal's rifle. He had learned to shoot as a boy, and his aim was true. When Pastor Whitmore tried to circle around behind the federal agents, James's shot sent him diving for cover. The gunfight was brief but intense. The marshal's superior training and coordination quickly overwhelmed the desperate conspirators. Within minutes, the square was filled with gun smoke and the groans of wounded men. When the smoke cleared, Elder Blackwood lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and defeat. Tom Fletcher and Buck Williams were both down, their weapons scattered in the dust. Pastor Whitmore had his hands raised in surrender, his face white with terror. Marshal Kane stood over Blackwood, his smoking gun still in his hand. "It's over," he said simply. The crowd stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The men who had ruled their lives with iron fists for decades were now broken and defeated, their power shattered forever. "People of Millfield Creek," Marshal Kane announced, his voice carrying across the square, "you are free. Free from the corruption that has poisoned your community for 25 years. Free to build something better." Sarah May stepped out from behind the wagon, her hand finding James's. Together they walked to the center of the square, no longer outcasts but symbols of hope for a new beginning. "What happens now?" asked Mrs. Henderson, her voice small and uncertain. "Now you learn to govern yourselves," Marshal Kane replied. "You elect honest leaders. You establish fair laws and you build a community based on truth instead of fear." James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who had been ready to kill him just hours before. "We can start over," he said quietly. "All of us. We can build something better than what we had." Over the following weeks, the truth came out in full. The network of corruption had reached far beyond Millfield Creek, involving officials in Denver and even Washington. The stolen land grants were returned to their rightful owners, and the federal government provided compensation for the families of the murdered agents. Elder Blackwood and his surviving conspirators were transported to Denver to face federal charges. The trial made headlines across the territory, exposing the extent of the corruption and serving as a warning to other communities. James McKinley inherited his father's property, land that had been stolen and sold by Blackwood's network. More importantly, he inherited his father's legacy of courage and integrity. The Medal of Honor that had been awarded to Captain William McKinley was finally presented to his son in a ceremony that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Sarah May and James were married in the same town square where she had nearly been executed, but the atmosphere was completely different. The rigid social hierarchy had collapsed, replaced by a genuine sense of community. People who had been enemies were learning to work together, united by their shared experience of liberation. The new Millfield Creek was not perfect. No human community ever is, but it was honest. Decisions were made openly, disputes were settled fairly, and people were judged by their character rather than their wealth or connections. As the sun set on their wedding day, James and Sarah May stood together on the porch of their new home, looking out over the valley that had once been ruled by fear and corruption. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Neighbors worked together to repair the damage caused by years of neglect and mismanagement. "Do you think your father would be proud?" Sarah May asked, her hand resting on James's arm. James considered the question, thinking of the man he had never known but whose legacy had saved their lives. "I think he would be proud that his work was finally finished, that justice was finally served." "And what about us?" Sarah May asked. "Are you happy with how our story ended?" James turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. "This isn't the end of our story," he said softly. "This is just the beginning. We have a lifetime to build something beautiful together." In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. The railroad had finally come to Millfield Creek, bringing with it the promise of prosperity and connection to the wider world. But this time, the benefits would be shared by everyone, not hoarded by a corrupt few. The age of fear and lies was over. The age of hope and truth had begun. And in the center of it all, James McKinley and Sarah May stood together, their love having triumphed over prejudice, their courage having helped liberate an entire community from the chains of corruption. The dawn of a new day was breaking over Millfield Creek, and it was beautiful to behold.